Nobody asked Marie Antoinette if she wanted the necklace. That's the first thing to understand about the scandal that would destroy her reputation, humiliate the French monarchy, and help trigger a revolution that would kill thousands. The Queen of France never touched the necklace, never saw it in person, never negotiated for it, never wore it, never even knew the transaction was happening until it was too late. And yet, her name was dragged through the most spectacular fraud in French history so thoroughly that millions of people believed she had orchestrated the whole thing herself. The affair of the diamond necklace in 1785 had everything. A necklace worth the equivalent of $100 million today. A cardinal who believed a prostitute dressed as a queen. A con artist so audacious she forged royal correspondence with a pen name. A secret midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles. And a courtroom drama that turned into the opening act of the French Revolution. The woman at the center of it all, Jeanne de la Motte, was a nobody from nowhere who looked at the most glittering court in Europe and decided she could take it for everything it was worth. She nearly succeeded, and in failing, she did something more damaging than success would have achieved. She made France believe its queen was a thief, its church was corrupt, and its monarchy was rotten at the foundation. 4 years later, the Bastille fell. The necklace existed before the scandal, which is important. It wasn't created for a crime. It was created for a king who died before he could give it to his mistress, and that origin story, a piece of jewelry commissioned for adultery, paid for by French taxpayers, intended for a woman who wasn't the queen, set the moral tone for everything that followed. In the early 1770s, the court jewelers Baumer and Bassange had spent years assembling an extraordinary piece, 647 diamonds arranged in an elaborate confection of festoons, pendants, and tassels weighing nearly 3,000 carats. The original patron was Louis XV, who wanted something spectacular for his mistress, Madame du Barry. The jewelers acquired diamonds across Europe, went deeply into debt financing the purchases, and completed the necklace just in time for Louis XV to die of smallpox in 1774 before he could buy it. Baumer and Bassange were left with the most expensive piece of jewelry ever created and no buyer. They tried selling it to the new king, Louis XVI, for his queen, Marie Antoinette. She declined, once because the price was too high, once because France was at war and the expenditure seemed inappropriate. Marie Antoinette's refusal was genuine, and given her subsequent reputation for extravagance, historically ironic. The one piece of jewelry explicitly offered to her, she turned down. The one she would be accused of stealing, she had never wanted. The jewelers were desperate. The necklace had cost them everything. Without selling it, they faced ruin. They approached Marie Antoinette repeatedly, pressing their case with increasing anxiety. In a moment that would later be used against her, Baumer wrote her a letter in 1781 expressing his devotion and his confidence that the necklace would eventually be hers. She found the letter bizarre, didn't understand its meaning, burned it. The letter's existence, and her dismissive response, would later be distorted into evidence of a transaction she had never conducted. Into this situation, in the early 1780s, came Jeanne de Valois de la Motte. Her name tells a story she had carefully constructed. De Valois, a claim to descent from an illegitimate branch of the French royal family, providing just enough aristocratic connection to open doors while being sufficiently obscure to resist scrutiny. De la Motte, the name of the man she had married, a minor military officer named Nicolas de la Motte, who would prove useful as a traveling accomplice and largely irrelevant as everything else. Jeanne's actual origins were genuinely miserable. Born in 1756 to a father who drank himself to death claiming the Valois connection, she had spent part of her childhood literally begging on roadsides with her siblings before a charitable noblewoman took her in and provided some education and stability. She emerged from this childhood with a precise understanding of what aristocratic life looked like from the outside, a burning resentment of those who had it from birth, and a talent for performance and manipulation that her hard years had honed into something formidable. By the early 1780s, she had established herself at the fringes of Versailles, not inside the court exactly, but near enough to be seen, to cultivate connections, to present herself as a woman of consequence temporarily embarrassed by financial difficulty. She was attractive, charming, and absolutely relentless. She also had a particular talent that would prove decisive. She had become close to Louis-René Édouard de Rohan, Cardinal of Strasbourg and Grand Almoner of France, one of the most powerful clerics in the country and the most gullible. Rohan's problem was Marie Antoinette, specifically the Queen's comprehensive and clearly expressed contempt for him. Years earlier, while serving as French ambassador in Vienna, Rohan had written letters home making disparaging remarks about Empress Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother. The letters had been intercepted, shared with the Empress, and naturally found their way to her daughter when Marie Antoinette became Queen of France. She had never forgiven him. In a court where royal favor was everything, Rohan had been in the Queen's disfavor for years, denied the influence his rank should have commanded, unable to advance despite his position. He wanted reconciliation desperately, not for sentimental reasons. Rohan was not a particularly sensitive man, but for the entirely practical reason that a cardinal who didn't have the Queen's favor was a cardinal with limited future prospects, and Rohan had expensive tastes and larger ambitions. He needed someone to help him repair the relationship. Jeanne told him she could. This was the first lie, and it was a sophisticated one because it was almost plausible. Jeanne claimed an intimate friendship with Marie Antoinette, private conversations at Versailles, confidences exchanged, a relationship of genuine warmth beneath the formality of court life. She was careful about what she claimed. She didn't say she could arrange a formal reconciliation or a court audience. She suggested she was helping things along quietly, that the Queen's attitude was softening, that Rohan's patient virtue was being noticed. She fed him hope in carefully measured doses, enough to keep him engaged, never enough to allow him to verify anything directly. To fund her expanding lifestyle, Jeanne had taken a house in Paris, was entertaining extensively, and was spending money she didn't have on clothes, furniture, and the appearance of wealth that aristocratic connection required. She borrowed from Rohan and others, citing her closeness to the Queen as implicit security. This was fraud of a fairly ordinary type. What she constructed next was something altogether more spectacular. She began forging letters, not complicated diplomatic correspondence, just notes written in a hand she had practiced, signed Marie Antoinette de France. The content was carefully calibrated to Rohan's desires, warm expressions of regard, suggestions that his efforts were appreciated, hints that reconciliation was progressing. She had studied the Queen's style carefully enough to make the letters plausible to a man who desperately wanted to believe them. Rohan read the forged letters and felt hope he hadn't allowed himself in years. Then she arranged the meeting. On the evening of August 11th, 1784, Rohan was brought to the gardens of Versailles at night, to the Grove of Venus. He was told the Queen would appear briefly, a secret encounter, impossible to arrange officially, arranged through Jeanne's personal connection. A woman appeared, veiled in a white dress. She spoke a few words. She handed him a rose. She disappeared. Rohan was overcome. The Queen had forgiven him. The woman was Nicole Leguay, a young Parisian prostitute Jeanne had recruited because she physically resembled Marie Antoinette. She had been coached on the few words to speak, dressed carefully, and positioned in darkness sufficient to prevent close examination. The performance lasted under 2 minutes. Rohan believed completely. He had, in the dark, in a garden, met the woman who had despised him for a decade, received her forgiveness and a symbolic rose, and felt the path to rehabilitation open before him. He had met a prostitute wearing a white dress. The actual Marie Antoinette had been inside the palace, unaware any of this was happening. With the cardinal fully committed to the fiction of his reconciliation with the Queen, Jeanne moved to the transaction that would make the affair historic. In late 1784, she approached Rohan with a proposition, The queen wanted the diamond necklace, but couldn't purchase it directly. The expenditure would be politically embarrassing given France's financial difficulties and the public criticism of royal extravagance. She needed an intermediary, someone she trusted, to conduct the negotiation secretly. Would the cardinal be willing to act on her behalf? The proposition required Rohan to believe several things simultaneously: that the queen trusted him as her secret agent, that Marie Antoinette wanted a necklace she had publicly declined twice, and that the most powerful queen in Europe needed a cardinal who until recently had been in her disfavor to conduct a clandestine jewelry purchase. Any one of these should have raised questions. Together, they should have been obviously implausible. Rohan believed all of them because he wanted to. The forged letters, the midnight meeting, the months of carefully cultivated hope had done their work. He approached Boomer and Bassange with an offer. The cardinal would guarantee the purchase. The queen would acquire the necklace in installments, the first payment due in August 1785. The jewelers were desperate enough to accept unusual terms. They wanted to sell. They were told the queen was the buyer. They required documentation. Jeanne produced it, a contract with the queen's signature, Marie Antoinette de France, and Rohan's countersignature as guarantor. The cardinal held the document, looked at the royal signature, and noticed something that should have ended the entire scheme instantly. Queens of France did not sign documents as Marie Antoinette de France. They signed with their first name only, Marie Antoinette, nothing more. The addition of de France was a mistake no one familiar with court procedure would have made. Rohan noticed the irregularity, mentioned it to Jeanne. She produced an explanation, a formality, a special notation for unofficial correspondence, something plausible enough for a man who had already committed himself emotionally to believing. He accepted it. He signed as guarantor. The necklace was handed over. On February 1st, 1785, Boomer and Bassange delivered the necklace in its case to Rohan. He brought it to Jeanne's Paris house, where a man claiming to be the queen's personal valet was waiting to receive it. The man, almost certainly Jeanne's husband Nicolas, took the necklace, got into a carriage, and disappeared. The necklace was immediately broken apart, its stones distributed and sold across France and in London, where Nicolas de la Motte conducted the sales personally. Within weeks, the most expensive piece of jewelry ever created had been converted into cash and scattered across Europe. The scheme should have been discovered quickly. Boomer expected his first payment in August 1785. When it didn't arrive, he wrote to the Queen, the actual Marie Antoinette, expressing confusion about the delay and referencing her purchase. The Queen, reading a letter about a transaction she knew nothing of, was baffled. Her attendants investigated. The cardinal was summoned. The cardinal produced his documentation. Within days, the entire structure of Jeanne's fraud was visible. Louis XVI was furious in the specific way of men who are not naturally furious, quietly, thoroughly, with a focus on proper procedure that suggested deep personal outrage held under careful control. He had two options for handling the cardinal's arrest: deal with it privately through royal authority, suppressing the scandal and avoiding public exposure, or proceed through the courts and let the legal system run its course. His advisors were divided. Marie Antoinette, whose reputation was at the center of the accusations, insisted on the courts. She wanted public vindication. It was the worst possible decision, made for entirely understandable reasons. A public trial would air every detail of the fraud, including the forged letters bearing her signature and the midnight meeting in which a prostitute had impersonated her. Proceeding privately would have allowed the affair to be hushed up, Rohan quietly disgraced, Jeanne punished without publicity. The Queen chose transparency because she was innocent and believed innocence would be obvious. She was wrong about what public trials do with innocence. On August 15th, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, the most important religious holiday in the Catholic calendar, with the court assembled for Mass, Louis XVI had Rohan arrested at Versailles. The timing was deliberate. a public humiliation. The Cardinal of Strasbourg, Grand Almoner of France, was taken into custody in his full ecclesiastical robes as the court watched. Whatever sympathy Rohan might have attracted as a victim of fraud evaporated somewhat in the spectacle of his arrest. To those inclined to see conspiracy rather than manipulation, the arrest looked like royal overreach against a churchman. Jeanne was arrested shortly after. Her husband, Nicolas, escaped to England. Nicole Leguay, the woman who had impersonated the Queen, was arrested and would eventually be released, having been a minor instrument in a scheme she barely understood. Alessandro Cagliostro, an Italian occultist and confidence man who moved in the same circles and had lent an air of mystical nonsense to some of Rohan's thinking, was arrested for good measure. The trial would have 5 defendants, most of them peripheral to the actual crime. The Parlement of Paris, the judicial body that would try the case, was not a neutral institution. It was composed of hereditary nobles who had spent years in conflict with the royal court over legal and political authority. Many of its members were predisposed against the crown and would use any available tool to embarrass it. The trial of the century dropped into their hands like a gift. The proceedings lasted months and were followed across France and Europe with an attention that the printed press, pamphlets, gazettes, satirical prints, fed continuously. Believed a fraudster rather than look too. Believed a fraudster rather than look too closely at evidence because he wanted the reconciliation to be real. All of it was public, all of it was discussed, and all of it reflected in the court of public opinion on the woman whose name ran through the entire affair, Marie Antoinette. On May 31st, 1786, the Parlement delivered its verdicts. Rohan was acquitted of all charges. The court found he had been deceived rather than complicit. Cagliostro was acquitted. Nicole Leguay was acquitted. Jeanne de la Motte was convicted of theft and fraud, sentenced to be publicly flogged, branded with the letter 5 for volus, thief, on both shoulders, and imprisoned for life in the Salpêtrière prison. The verdicts were legally defensible. They were politically catastrophic for the monarchy. Rohan's acquittal was greeted with popular celebration in Paris. Crowds cheered outside the Palais de Justice. In the logic of those who had already decided the Queen was guilty, Rohan's acquittal was evidence of her guilt. If he had been deceived, someone had deceived him, and the pamphlets and popular opinion had already decided who that someone was. Marie Antoinette, who was entirely innocent of everything she was accused of, was made to look like she had lost her own trial. The king was livid at the acquittal. He exiled Rohan from Paris and stripped him of his position as Grand Almoner, using royal prerogative to punish a man the courts had cleared. This intervention, legally questionable and politically disastrous, confirmed for many observers that the crown was above the law. The royal couple, who had demanded a public trial to establish the Queen's innocence, had produced a public outcome that made her look guilty and made the king look tyrannical. Jeanne, sentenced to life imprisonment, escaped from the Salpêtrière within a year. The escape was almost certainly assisted. The complicity of prison officials purchased with money that had come from the necklace's sale. She reached England, joined her husband Nicolas in London, and immediately began publishing memoirs. The memoirs were spectacular fictions that implicated the Queen directly in the necklace affair, claiming Marie Antoinette had orchestrated the entire scheme and that Jeanne was being punished for knowing too much. They were widely read across Europe. They were believed by people who wanted to believe them. The pamphlet literature that had followed the trial mutated into something darker. Marie Antoinette had been the subject of scurrilous literature before the necklace affair. Her Austrian origins, her early extravagance, her friendships with women who were rumored to be more than friends had all provided material for satirists. After the trial, the attacks became systematic and vicious. She was portrayed as sexually depraved, politically treacherous, a foreign agent bleeding France for Austria's benefit. Madame Deficit became her nickname, attributing to her personally the financial crisis that had much deeper structural causes. Every accusation stuck because the necklace affair had primed the public to believe the worst. The financial crisis that was actually destroying France in the late 1780s had nothing to do with Marie Antoinette's jewelry budget. It had everything to do with the cost of the American Revolutionary War, in which France had intervened to spite Britain at ruinous expense, combined with decades of aristocratic tax exemption that left the burden of funding the state on those least able to bear it. These were structural problems requiring structural solutions. But structural problems are abstract. A queen who had been at the center of a diamond necklace scandal was vivid, specific, and easy to hate. Jeanne de la Motte died in London in 1791, falling, or jumping, from a window in a boarding house while reportedly trying to escape creditors or bailiffs. She was 35 years old. She had lived long enough to see the revolution begin, long enough to know that the scandal she had created had contributed to exactly the kind of destabilization she had perhaps intended, and perhaps simply blundered into. She did not live to see its full consequences. Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16, 1793, 8 years after the necklace affair, 4 years after the revolution began. She was 37. She rode to the guillotine in an open cart through streets lined with people who had been taught to hate her, many of them believing she had stolen a diamond necklace, which she hadn't, and bankrupted France, which she hadn't. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot as she mounted the scaffold and apologized. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Her last words, by most accounts, the same fastidious courtesy that had led her husband to wear 2 shirts to his own execution. The connection between the affair of the diamond necklace and the French Revolution is a matter of degree rather than simple causation. The revolution had structural causes: financial collapse, aristocratic privilege, Enlightenment ideas about rights and governance, a harvest failure that created food shortages across France, that would have produced some kind of crisis regardless of what happened to a necklace in 1785. But the affair accelerated the delegitimization of the monarchy in the specific way that personal scandals delegitimize institutions, by making abstract corruption concrete and visible. The philosopher Thomas Carlyle, writing in the 1830s, understood this clearly. He described the necklace affair as the beginning of the end for the French monarchy, the moment when the mystique of royal authority was punctured irreparably. An institution can survive policy failures, financial crises, even military defeats, because these can be attributed to circumstance. What institutions cannot easily survive is being made ridiculous, being associated in the public mind with fraud, with a prostitute impersonating a queen in a dark garden, with a cardinal so desperate for royal favor that he believed forged letters. The dignity that had sustained the French monarchy for centuries was incompatible with farce. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Rohan survived the revolution, living until 1803 and spending most of his later years in Germany. Nicolas de la Motte disappeared into the historical record after his wife's death. Nicole Leguay, the woman who had briefly been the queen for 2 minutes in a garden, also disappeared into obscurity, returned to whatever life a young Parisian woman could make after being briefly implicated in the trial of the century.